Before you hear this story, I want to say something that took me a long time to admit to myself. I am not a careless man. I never have been. I spent 31 years as a building inspector for the city of Columbus, Ohio. My job was to walk into a structure other people had built and find what was wrong with it. Hairline cracks in the foundation. Load-bearing walls that weren't quite plumb. The kind of thing that looks fine on the surface until it doesn't. I was good at that. Better than most. So when this happened to me, the part that kept me up at night wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the question I couldn't stop asking. How did I miss it? Ask yourself something before I go any further. If the person trying to take everything from you was someone you'd watched grow up, someone you'd driven to soccer practice and helped with college applications and walked down the aisle, would you see it coming? I didn't think so. My name is George. I'm 63 years old, and I live in a 2-bedroom ranch house on the east side of Columbus that I've owned outright since 2019. No mortgage. Paid it off early, the way my father taught me. He used to say that a man without debt sleeps better than a king. He wasn't wrong. I retired from the city 3 years ago with a full pension and a firm handshake from a deputy director I'd never liked. My wife Patricia passed 4 years before that. Breast cancer. We had 11 good years together, and then we had 2 hard ones, and then she was gone. After she died, I stayed in the house. I didn't see any reason to leave. The neighbors knew me. The grocery store was 8 minutes away. The yard needed work every spring, and that was fine because the yard gave me something to do. What I did not have was children of my own. What I had was a stepson. Patricia had a son from her first marriage. His name is Brandon. He was 22 when I married his mother, old enough that I never tried to replace anyone, never pretended to be something I wasn't. We settled into a kind of cordial understanding. He came for holidays. He called on her birthday. When she got sick, he showed up, which I gave him credit for. Some people disappear when things get hard. Brandon didn't. After Patricia died, we stayed in touch. Not constantly. Once a month, maybe. A text here, a phone call there. He lived in Cincinnati with his wife and 2 kids, about 100 miles southwest. He had a decent job in logistics, from what I understood. He seemed fine. The watch arrived on a Thursday in February. I remember the day because there was a thin coat of ice on the driveway and I nearly went down getting to the mailbox. It was a small package, priority mail, with Brandon's handwriting on the label. Inside was a smartwatch, a nicer one than I would have bought myself. Silver band, black face, the kind that tracks your heart rate and your steps and your sleep. The card said, "Dad, I know you never ask for anything. That's exactly why I got this. Take care of yourself. Love, Brandon." He had never called me Dad before, not once in 15 years. I stood in the hallway and read that card 3 times. I'm going to be honest with you. It felt like being welcomed into something you'd been standing outside of for a long time. I put the watch on that same afternoon, even though I had nowhere to go. I wore it to the hardware store. I wore it to my friend Curtis's house that weekend, where we watched the Buckeyes lose a game they should have won, and argued about it the way we always do. Curtis is 71, ex-military, retired postal service. He noticed the watch immediately. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. "Brandon sent it, for no reason." Curtis picked up my wrist and looked at it the way a man looks at something he's trying to decide about. He turned it over, looked at the band, set my arm back down. "That's a nice piece," he said. But he said it the way you say something when what you actually mean is something else. I didn't ask him what he meant. I should have. For 2 weeks, I wore that watch the way Brandon intended, or the way I believed he intended. I wore it on my morning walks around the Blendon Woods Park Trail. I wore it during my weekly phone calls with my financial advisor, a man named Paul I'd been working with for 9 years. I wore it when I talked to my accountant about selling some of the municipal bonds Patricia had left behind. I talked out loud in the way you do when you live alone, and the house is quiet, and your own voice is the only company. I talked about the bonds, about the pension, about the small rental property I owned on the east side, the one I'd been considering selling because the roof was getting old. I gave away a great deal about myself in those 2 weeks. I just didn't know it yet. It was Curtis who finally said what he'd been thinking. We were at his kitchen table on a Sunday, and he pulled out his reading glasses and was holding my wrist again, looking at the watch the way he used to look at equipment he didn't trust. He asked me to take it off. "George," he said, "I need you to look at something with me." He had his laptop open. He showed me an article, then a forum thread, then a product teardown from some tech site I'd never heard of. He walked me through it slowly, the way he used to explain things when he trained new postal workers. Patient, specific, no drama. Certain smartwatches, he explained, the low-cost ones that mimic premium brands, had been documented with vulnerabilities. Some had been modified intentionally. They could be paired to a secondary device without the user's knowledge. The microphone meant for voice commands could be activated remotely. Location data, always running, could be accessed through a companion app if someone had the pairing code. I listened without moving. "You'd need to know someone's home Wi-Fi password to complete the pairing," Curtis said, "and you'd need to set it up before they received it." I thought about Brandon's handwriting on the label, the card that said "Dad" for the first time. "Take it to the police," Curtis said, "before you confront anyone." I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house the way I used to listen to buildings I was inspecting, looking for the thing that was wrong that you couldn't see yet. The Columbus Police Department's non-emergency line sent me to a detective named Aguilar. She was younger than I expected, sharp, the kind of person who takes notes and actually reads them back to you. She asked me to bring the watch in. I drove down on my lunch break, force of habit. I still think of noon as my lunch break, even though I haven't had a job in 3 years. They took the watch into a back room. When Aguilar came back, she had a man with her from the technical unit. He set the watch on the table between us, without a word. The way you set something down when you want the weight of it to speak for itself. "It's been paired," he said. "The microphone access is active. Whoever set this up would have needed physical access to the device and your network credentials." I thought about the previous Thanksgiving, when Brandon had come up from Cincinnati with his family. How he'd asked for the Wi-Fi password to connect his kids' tablets. "Has anyone had access to your home recently?" Aguilar asked. I gave her the answer she was looking for. She told me not to confront anyone. She told me to go home, put the watch back on, and act as though nothing had changed. She said that phrase like it was simple, as though normal was something you could just decide to be. I drove back to my house. I put the watch on the kitchen counter. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Silver band, black face. A gift from a man who called me Dad for the first time in 15 years. Then I put it back on. What came next required a kind of discipline I didn't know I had. The kind that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with stillness. I went to the grocery store. I mowed the back section of the yard even though it was February and barely worth the trouble. I called Paul, my financial advisor, and spoke at normal length about normal things. I wore the watch through all of it. 2 days after my visit to the police, Brandon called. "Just checking in," you said. "You sound a little tired lately." I hadn't spoken to him in 3 weeks. "I'm fine," I said. "Just slower in the mornings. Getting old, I guess." He laughed. That comfortable laugh he had. "You're not old, Dad. You just need to take it easier. That's all." After I hung up, I sat in the car in my own driveway for 20 minutes. The pattern became clear quickly once I knew what to look for. I would say something while wearing the watch. Something about money, about property, about my health. And within 36 to 48 hours, Brandon would call or text, touching on exactly that thing. Casually. Gently. With the right amount of concern in his voice, I mentioned to no one that my knee had been bothering me and I'd been skipping my morning walks. 3 days later, Brandon texted, "Hope you're getting some rest. Don't push yourself." He had never in his life texted me anything like that. I sat in my kitchen with the watch on, that I'd been thinking about whether it still made sense for me to be managing my own finances at my age. I said it experimentally, the way a detective lays out bait. That evening, Brandon called and mentioned, gently, that he knew a financial planner in Cincinnati who specialized in helping seniors transition their accounts. He said the word seniors with particular care, like he'd practiced not making it sound like an insult. That was when the anger arrived. Not hot and immediate, cold. The kind you feel in your back teeth. I called Aguilar. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "This is consistent with what we've seen in financial exploitation cases," she said. "The surveillance is a means to an end. The end is usually control." "What kind of control?" I asked. She explained it carefully. Power of attorney, obtained by demonstrating that the subject lacks capacity to manage their own affairs. A conservatorship petition, which in Ohio requires documentation of incapacity. Audio recordings, selectively edited, could be used to build that case. Recorded conversations about forgetting things, about needing help, about feeling overwhelmed. I thought about every sentence I'd spoken in the past 2 weeks. "Don't sign anything," she said. "Don't give verbal consent to anything financial. And keep doing what you're doing." What I was doing was becoming someone I didn't recognize. I started letting small things slip on purpose. I said in the kitchen that I'd almost missed a property tax payment. I mentioned that sometimes I had trouble remembering whether I'd taken my blood pressure medication. Each sentence tasted like something spoiled. But I said them. Brandon's response time shortened. He started calling instead of texting. He started steering every conversation toward a single destination. "Wouldn't it be easier if someone was helping you manage things? I trust you. You trust me. It makes sense." I had not told him about the property tax payment. I had not told him about the medication. He brought up both, casually, within days of each one. One evening he said, "I've been doing some research. There are some legal structures that can really protect you, Dad. Make sure your assets go where you want them to go. Make sure nobody takes advantage of you. Nobody takes advantage of you." He said it with a straight face. I said, "That makes sense. I'll think about it." Then I drove to Curtis's house and sat in his living room and told him everything. He handed me a glass of water and didn't say a word until I was finished. "You need a lawyer," he said. "I know. Not eventually. Now." I called an elder law attorney the next morning. Her name is Vivian Fletcher, and her office is near the Ohio State campus in one of those old brick buildings that used to be something else. She was direct and unhurried, which I appreciated. She told me that Ohio conservatorship fraud was more common than most people imagined, that it typically required a paper trail the victim had unknowingly helped build, and that the combination of audio surveillance and financial approach was a documented pattern. She also told me something that stopped me cold. She said, "You mentioned he's been contacting your financial advisor's office." Paul's office had received a call, she'd confirmed with a colleague, from someone identifying himself as a family member, requesting information about my account status. He'd been told they couldn't speak to him without written authorization. He had mentioned that authorization was being arranged. I had not given him authorization. I had not mentioned it. I sat in Vivian Fletcher's office in that old brick building near campus and understood, for the first time, the full shape of what was happening. This was not impulsive. This was planned. This had been planned for some time. The next week was the hardest part of this whole story, and not for the reason you might expect. It wasn't hard because of Brandon. It was hard because of what I had to do alone. I could not call anyone casually. I could not talk through my feelings in my own kitchen. I could not even think too loudly, because thinking out loud had become a liability. I wrote things down instead, by hand, in a yellow legal pad I kept in the car. Dates, times, quotes I could remember. Vivian had told me that handwritten contemporaneous notes carried weight. She used that word, contemporaneous, and I wrote that down too because I wanted to remember it. Curtis helped me organize what I had. He printed things out. He is the kind of man who still has a working printer and a filing cabinet. And in that moment, I was grateful for both. A younger officer who reviewed the initial report said it looked like a family dispute, that a financial crime required a completed financial crime, not just preparation. He said it with the particular boredom of someone who has said it many times before. I sat in the parking lot afterward and breathed through my nose until my hands steadied. Then I went home and made a decision. I called Brandon. Not confrontational, not emotional, careful. Brandon, I said, I've been thinking about what you mentioned. About the legal planning. I think I'm ready to sit down with someone and go over my documents. Would you be willing to come up to Columbus? There was a brief silence, the kind where you can hear someone reorienting. Of course, he said. Absolutely. I've actually already talked to an attorney I think you'd really trust. I'll bet you have, I thought. He suggested meeting the following Saturday at my house. I said I prefer somewhere neutral. I mentioned the name of my bank, a branch I'd used for 20 years. I said I'd already spoken with my branch manager. He agreed without hesitation. Over the next 4 days, Vivian Fletcher coordinated with Aguilar. Paul from the financial advisor's office agreed to cooperate. The branch manager, a woman named Colleen who I'd known since before Patricia died, prepared a conference room and a very specific kind of welcome. Brandon arrived on Saturday in a sport coat. He was carrying a leather portfolio and a relaxed smile and the particular confidence of someone who believes they have already won. He shook my hand with both of his, the way he always did. I introduced him to Colleen. I introduced him to the man from the legal department I didn't actually name, which I noticed him. Notice. We sat down around the table. I put the smartwatch on the table between us. Not dramatically. Just set it down. The way you set something down that no longer belongs to you. Brandon looked at it. Then he looked at me. Colleen opened a folder. She explained that the bank had received an inquiry. She named the date and the caller, claiming to represent my financial interests. She asked Brandon if he could clarify his authorization to make such a call. I'm just trying to help, Brandon said. You know how it is at his age. I'm worried about him. At his age. There it was, offered up like it was common sense. Aguilar, who had been sitting quietly near the door, leaned forward. The device on the table, she said, was found to have been modified to allow remote audio access and location tracking. We've traced the secondary paired account. She didn't elaborate. She let that sit in the room. Brandon's posture changed. Not much, just enough. He started. I slid the printed email across the table. It was one he'd sent to someone I didn't know, a contact whose name appeared in the account linked to the secondary paired device. The email discussed in plain terms the steps required to establish guardianship over a senior who was, and I am quoting, resistant to help, but clearly struggling to manage independently. He had written that. About me. The room was quiet. Colleen looked at her folder. Aguilar watched Brandon. I watched the watch. Brandon said, I was trying to protect you. I looked at him. I took a breath. You were trying to replace me, I said. His attorney, who had been so confident until this point, began speaking about intent and interpretation and the complexity of family dynamics. Aguilar let him finish. Then she told Brandon she needed him to come with her. Brandon looked at me when he stood up. A long look. I don't know what he was looking for. You should have just picked up the phone, I said. I would have talked to you about any of this. He didn't answer. He left the room, and the air in there rearranged itself around his absence. I drove home alone, past the strip malls on Broad Street, past the church with the sign that always has something both wrong and right on it, past the park where I'd been walking every morning with that watch on my wrist, like I trusted it. The house was exactly as I'd left it, which I know sounds like nothing, but it meant something to me. The boots by the door, the good chair by the window, The thermostat I'd calibrated exactly the way I liked it, which Patricia always thought was too warm, and which I've kept exactly the same since she died. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen and drank it. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to the feeling you get when you finish a very hard job. Not happy. Just done. And still standing. The investigation moved forward over the following months. I won't tell you how it ended, because it hasn't ended entirely, and I've learned not to confuse a chapter closing with the story being over. What I will tell you is that I updated every document I owned, changed every password, closed 2 accounts, and opened new ones under terms I chose. I met with Vivian Fletcher 4 more times. I moved the rental property into a trust, with Curtis as one of the named trustees, which made him prouder than he'd admit. Paul still manages my accounts. He added a verbal security protocol for any family-related inquiries. We laughed about it the first time I used it. Neither of us laughed very hard. Curtis slapped me on the shoulder one morning outside his house and said, "You good?" I nodded, getting there. He handed me my coffee without another word. That's the thing about the people who actually have your back. They don't make a big production of it. I stopped wearing smartwatches. I know that sounds like a small thing, and maybe it is, but to me it represents something larger. I went back to the old wristwatch I've had since 2001, the one with a crack in the crystal that I've never gotten fixed because everything still works. It just looks a little damaged. I've started thinking that describes a lot of things that are still worth keeping. I stayed in the house. I still walk the Blendon Woods Trail in the mornings. I still watch the Buckeyes lose games they should win and argue with Curtis about it. Some nights I sit in the good chair by the window and think about the card that came with the watch. Take care of yourself. Love, Brandon. I've thought about it enough to know that there may have been a version of him that meant some of that. People are complicated in ways that don't fit neatly into the story you're trying to tell about them. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because it's true, and because pretending otherwise would mean lying to you, and I've been lied to enough to know the cost. What I learned at 63 is that a man can spend his whole career inspecting other people's structures, looking for cracks, and still miss the one forming in his own foundation. Not because he's foolish, because he was ready, finally, to believe that someone saw him as family. That's not weakness. That's what trust costs sometimes. So here's what I'll leave you with. Document your life. Not because you expect trouble, but because your memory and your word shouldn't be the only record that you're capable and present and in control of your own name. Keep copies of your important papers somewhere other than your home. Know who has access to your accounts and revoke what you never consciously gave. If someone offers you unsolicited help with your finances, your health decisions, or your legal documents, ask yourself who benefits if you agree. And if you get a gift from someone who hasn't called you Dad in 15 years and then calls you Dad for the first time in the card, sit with that. Don't rush it. Let the feeling be nice if it is, but pay attention. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the thing that looks like a threat. Sometimes it's the thing that looks like love. If this story left something sitting in your chest, don't ignore that. Talk about it. Share it with someone you trust. These situations survive because people are ashamed to say it happened to them. There's no shame in being careful. There's no shame in protecting what you built. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm George, and you've been listening to Voices of Uncle Samuel. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. I read every one, and if someone you know needs to hear this, share it with them. That's how the light gets in. I've had a long time now to sit with what happened. Not just the facts of it, but the shape of it, the way it moved. The way I almost didn't see it until Curtis put my wrist down on that table and looked at me like a man who already knew the answer to a question he didn't want to ask out loud. What I keep coming back to is this. Brandon didn't fail because his plan was reckless. He failed because he underestimated something he thought he had already measured. He thought he knew exactly how much I was paying attention. He thought 63 meant slowing down. He thought a pension and a paid-off house and a man living alone meant a door left open. That's the thing about assumptions. They feel like strategy right up until they don't. I'm not going to pretend I handled every moment of this perfectly. I made mistakes. I called him too soon, said too much, tipped my hand before Aguilar was ready. There were nights I sat in that car in my own driveway and came very close to letting anger make the decision for me. Anger is loud. It wants to move fast. It doesn't care what it costs you on the way out. What saved me wasn't cleverness. It was the habit of stillness I'd built over 31 years of walking into other people's buildings and looking for what was wrong before I said a word. You don't accuse a structure, you observe it. You document. You let it show you where the stress is before you decide what to do about it. That discipline is not something you're born with. It's something you choose over and over in the moments when everything in you wants to do the opposite. That's what I mean when I talk about resilience. Not toughness, not the absence of fear. The ability to stay methodical when your hands are shaking. And the ethics of it, that part matters too. I used the watch against Brandon the same way he'd used it against me. I said things I didn't mean to see how he'd respond. Some nights that felt necessary. Some nights it felt like I was becoming something I didn't want to be. I think both things were true at the same time. Protecting yourself sometimes requires you to move through uncomfortable territory. The measure of your character is whether you come out the other side still recognizing your own face. Curtis knew something was wrong before I said a word about it. That's what decades of real friendship looks like. He didn't perform concern. He handed me the information and let me decide. Vivian Fletcher didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me what I needed to know. Those two people, in their different ways, are the reason I still have my name on my own accounts. What Brandon planted, he harvested, not because the universe arranged it that way, but because his own actions created a paper trail, a digital record, a room full of people who had seen enough. Cause and consequence. It moves slower than we want it to, and it doesn't always look dramatic when it arrives. Sometimes it looks like a woman sliding a printed email across a conference table in a quiet room. I still walk the Blendon Woods Trail in the mornings. I still wear the old watch with the cracked crystal. I still talk too much to myself in the kitchen, which is fine now, because nobody's listening but me. That's enough. That's exactly enough.